The summer air in Constantinople in July of 1054 was thick with heat and tension. Imagine the scene. A group of stern-faced men from Rome, led by a cardinal named Humbert of Silva Candida, stride purposefully into the magnificent Hagia Sophia. This was the heart of Eastern Christianity, a building so vast and beautiful it was said to have been designed by angels. But these men were not here for prayer, or to marvel at the golden mosaics that shimmered in the candlelight. They carried a document, a papal bull that would act as a stick of dynamite, ready to shatter 1,000 years of shared faith. The city's patriarch, Michael Cerularius, was their target. The Roman legates felt he had disrespected the Pope's authority, and they had come to deliver a final shocking response. Humbert and his delegation marched directly to the high altar during the afternoon liturgy. This was a calculated act of defiance, a deliberate interruption of the most sacred ritual of the Eastern Church. In front of the astonished clergy and congregation, Humbert slammed the bull of excommunication down onto the altar. It declared Patriarch Michael and his followers to be heretics, cut off from the one true church. The document was filled with accusations, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated, but its message was brutally clear. Constantinople had strayed, and Rome was casting it out. The gasps and murmurs that must have rippled through the great church were the first tremors of an earthquake that would permanently divide the Christian world. The Roman delegates didn't linger. Having delivered their bombshell, they turned on their heels and marched out. As they left the sacred space, they symbolically shook the dust from their feet, a gesture of finality and condemnation. The immediate aftermath was one of chaos and outrage. A deacon, in a desperate attempt to reverse the act, ran after Humbert, begging him to take back the dreadful document. The cardinal refused. The bull was picked up from the ground where it had been thrown and brought to Patriarch Michael. He was a proud and powerful man, not one to accept such a public humiliation without a fight. The insult was not just to him, but to his emperor, his city, and his entire tradition. Just a few days later, Michael Cerularius convened his own synod. He responded in kind. He and his bishops issued their own decree, anathematizing Cardinal Humbert and the other papal legates. They accused the Romans of arrogance, of corrupting the ancient faith, and of attempting to subjugate the Eastern churches under the tyrannical rule of the Pope. This was more than just a theological spat between two grumpy old churchmen. It was the moment when two halves of an empire, two great centers of Christian thought and culture, formally and angrily declared that they could no longer walk the same path. For the ordinary people in the pews, their world had just been split down the middle. The dramatic events of 1054 didn't happen in a vacuum. They were the culmination of centuries of growing apart. At the heart of the division were two great cities, Rome and Constantinople. Rome was the old capital of the empire, a city steeped in history and law, but by the 11th century, it was a shadow of its former self, battered by invasions and political instability. Its church, however, led by the Pope, claimed a unique authority passed down directly from the Apostle Peter. This was the Latin West, where the language of scholars and priests was Latin, and the focus was increasingly on a single, centralized leader in the Bishop of Rome, who they believed held universal jurisdiction over all of Christendom. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the east, Constantinople was a glittering metropolis. It was the capital of the still thriving Byzantine Empire, a city of immense wealth, culture, and power. Known as the New Rome, its people spoke Greek and saw themselves as the true inheritors of the Roman legacy. Their emperor was not just a political leader, but was seen as God's chosen representative on earth, working in symphony with the Patriarch of Constantinople. They viewed the Western Church, and particularly the Pope, with suspicion. To them, the Pope was just one of 5 great patriarchs, the first among equals, but he was not an absolute monarch with the right to dictate faith and practice to the entire world. These cultural and political differences created two very different ways of being Christian. In the West, the legalistic Roman mind tended to define things with precise, logical formulas. Theology became a kind of sacred science. In the East, the Greek tradition was more mystical and philosophical. They preferred to approach the great mysteries of faith not with legal definitions, but with poetry, liturgy, and a sense of awe. This wasn't just about language, it was a fundamental difference in worldview. What one side saw as necessary clarity, the other often saw as arrogant presumption, an attempt to put God in a box. These differences seeped into everything, from art and music to the very way they prayed. Over the centuries, small disagreements festered and grew. Communication was slow and often fraught with misunderstanding. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Pope in Rome began to look to Frankish and Germanic kings for protection, further alienating him from the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. The two halves of the old empire were now on separate historical tracks. They faced different enemies, developed different political systems, and spoke different languages. They were like two siblings who had once shared a home, but now lived in different countries, writing to each other less and less, and finding they had less and less in common when they did. The schism was a family breakup centuries in the making. At the core of the 1054 split were specific theological disputes that may seem obscure to us today, but were matters of eternal importance to the people of the time. One of the most significant was the Filioque clause. This is a single Latin word meaning, "and the Son." The original Nicene Creed, a foundational statement of faith agreed upon by the whole Church in the 4th century, stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. However, churches in the West, starting in Spain, began adding the word Filioque, so that the creed read that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. They felt this addition helped clarify the divinity of Jesus Christ. To the Eastern churches, this was an outrage for two reasons. First, they believed it was theologically wrong. They argued that it distorted the understanding of the Trinity, suggesting two sources for the Spirit instead of one, which risked diminishing the unique role of the Father. For them, the Father was the sole source of divinity, from which both the Son and the Spirit originate. But just as importantly, they were furious that the Church of Rome had unilaterally altered the wording of a universal creed. This, in their eyes, was a shocking act of papal overreach. It seemed to prove their worst fears, that the Pope believed he had the authority to change the foundational faith of the Church, all by himself, without consulting the other patriarchs, in an ecumenical council. This leads us to the second major issue, papal primacy. What was the exact role of the Pope? Everyone agreed that the Bishop of Rome held a special place of honor. He was the successor to St. Peter, the chief of the apostles. But what did that honor mean in practice? The West developed a model of papal supremacy, believing the Pope had direct, supreme, and universal authority over the entire Church. He was the final judge in all matters of faith and doctrine. The East, however, held to a more collegial model. They saw the Church as a communion of sister churches, governed by the 5 great patriarchates: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. The Pope was the first among equals, but decisions affecting the whole Church had to be made in council together. Finally, there were differences in liturgical practice that became symbols of the deeper division. One of the most contentious was the type of bread used in the Eucharist, or Holy Communion. The Western Church used unleavened bread, just like the bread used at the Jewish Passover, which they believed was what Jesus used at the Last Supper. The Eastern Church, however, insisted on using leavened bread with yeast. To them, the leaven symbolized the risen Christ, the new life of the gospel. Each side accused the other of invalidating the sacrament. To the Greeks, the West's azymes were dead and Judaizing. To the Latins, the East's leavened bread was a break with apostolic tradition. These small details became battlegrounds, visible signs of who was right and who was wrong. Long before the final break in 1054, another fierce conflict had rocked the Byzantine Empire and strained relations with the West, the iconoclast controversy. For centuries, Christians had used images, icons, of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints in their worship. These were not seen as mere decorations. They were windows into heaven, sacred objects that helped the faithful connect with the divine. Believers would kiss the icons, light candles before them, and pray for intercession, believing the saint depicted could hear their prayers. For many, These painted wooden panels were an essential part of their spiritual life, a tangible connection to the holy figures they venerated. Then, in the 8th century, a movement known as iconoclasm, literally image-breaking, erupted. Emperor Leo III, possibly influenced by Islamic and Jewish prohibitions on religious imagery, and believing that a series of military disasters were signs of God's displeasure, declared that the veneration of icons was a form of idolatry. He ordered their removal and destruction. This plunged the empire into a brutal civil war of the soul that lasted for over 100 years. Imperial soldiers smashed mosaics, whitewashed church walls, and burned piles of precious icons. Those who defended the images, known as iconodules, or lovers of images, were persecuted, imprisoned, and sometimes even martyred for their faith. The popes in Rome were horrified by iconoclasm. They firmly sided with the iconodules, defending the use of images as important tools for teaching the faith, especially to the illiterate. They argued that since God became man in the person of Jesus Christ, he could be depicted. To deny the possibility of depicting Christ was, in a way, to deny the incarnation itself. The popes issued condemnations of the iconoclast emperors, which only widened the political and theological gulf between Rome and Constantinople. The conflict demonstrated how the emperor in the East felt he had the authority to define doctrine, a role the Pope believed was his own. It was another power struggle disguised as a theological debate. Ultimately, the iconodules triumphed. In 843, the Empress Theodora permanently restored the veneration of icons, an event still celebrated in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy. But the scars remained. The conflict had forced both sides to think deeply about the role of art, incarnation, and authority. The Eastern Orthodox Church developed a rich and profound theology of icons, seeing them as a vital confirmation of the Christian faith. The West also continued to use religious art, but it developed along a different path, leading eventually to the more naturalistic and humanistic styles of the Renaissance. The icon debate was a dress rehearsal for the Great Schism, revealing the deep-seated differences that were pulling the two worlds apart. The Great Schism of 1054 was the most famous split in Christianity, but well, it was not the first. To really understand the fragmented landscape of the Christian world, we have to go back even further, all the way to the 5th century. This was an age of intense debate about the very nature of Jesus Christ. Was he human? Was he divine? And if he was both, how did these two natures relate to each other? These weren't just abstract philosophical games. They were questions that went to the very heart of salvation. Getting the answer wrong, it was believed, could actually lead souls to damnation. Theologians across the Roman Empire argued furiously, and, honestly, their disputes often spilled over into riots in the streets. The flashpoint came at the Council of Chalcedon in the year 450. After much debate, the council, which was dominated by bishops from Rome and Constantinople, produced a definition that would become the standard for both the future Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. They declared that Christ had two natures, a human nature and a divine nature, united in a single person, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. This was a carefully balanced formula, designed to reject various heresies. For the bishops who signed it, it was a moment of profound clarity, a victory for truth that would safeguard the faith for all time. But for a huge number of Christians, particularly in the eastern provinces of the empire, like Egypt and Syria, the Chalcedonian definition was a disaster. These churches, which would become known as the Oriental Orthodox, found the language of two natures deeply troubling. They believed it came dangerously close to splitting Christ into two separate beings, a human person and a divine person. They preferred the language of St. Cyril of Alexandria, who spoke of one incarnate nature of the God Logos. They were not denying Christ's humanity, but they emphasized its complete and total union with his divinity. They became known as Miaphysites, from the Greek for one nature. The political fallout was immense. The churches of Egypt, the Coptic Church, Syria, the Syriac Orthodox Church, Armenia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Malankara Church in India all rejected the council's findings. The Byzantine emperors tried to force them to accept the Chalcedonian Creed, leading to centuries of bitter persecution. Bishops were deposed, monasteries were attacked, and a deep sense of alienation and resentment took root. This was the first great tear in the fabric of the Church. It created a third major branch of Christianity, distinct from both the Chalcedonian East, Constantinople, and West Rome. These ancient Oriental Orthodox churches have preserved their unique theology, liturgy, and culture to this day, a living testament to that first painful parting of ways. As the divide between Rome and Constantinople hardened, the Western Church itself was far from monolithic. During the High Middle Ages, as papal power reached its zenith, new movements emerged that challenged the authority and wealth of the established Church. They were often branded as heretics and brutally suppressed, but their ideas showed that the spirit of dissent was very much alive. Two of the most significant of these groups were the Cathars and the Waldensians. They offered a radically different vision of Christian life, one that tapped into a widespread hunger for spiritual purity and a return to the simplicity of the early apostles. The Cathars, who flourished in the Languedoc region of southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries, were perhaps the most radical. Their beliefs were so different from mainstream Christianity that they could almost be considered a separate religion. They held a dualistic worldview, believing that the physical world was an evil creation of a lesser God, while the spiritual world was the realm of the one true, good God. The human soul, they taught, was a divine spark trapped inside the prison of the evil physical body. The Catholic Church, with its wealthy bishops, ornate cathedrals, and focus on physical sacraments like the Eucharist, was seen as part of this corrupt material world, a tool of the devil, not of God. Cathar leaders, known as perfects, lived lives of extreme asceticism, rejecting meat, property, and marriage. They offered a path to liberation from the cycle of reincarnation in the evil physical world. Their message resonated strongly with many people, from peasants to nobles, who were disillusioned with the perceived corruption and arrogance of the official church. The response from Rome was merciless. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal 20-year war that devastated the Languedoc region. This was followed by the establishment of the Papal Inquisition, a systematic campaign to hunt down and eliminate the last vestiges of Catharism. By the early 14th century, the movement had been wiped out. The Waldensians, on the other hand, began not as heretics, but as a movement for reform within the Church. Their founder, a wealthy merchant from Lyon named Peter Waldo, had a conversion experience around 1173. He gave away his possessions and began to preach a message of voluntary poverty, public preaching, and adherence to the literal word of the Gospels. He arranged for parts of the Bible to be translated into the local vernacular, a radical act at a time when the scriptures were only available in Latin. The Waldensians, or the poor of Lyon, emphasized a simple life, rejecting the elaborate hierarchy and rituals of the Catholic Church. They were eventually excommunicated for preaching without permission and for challenging clerical authority, but their movement survived centuries of persecution in the remote valleys of the Alps. A century after the last of the Cathars were silenced, another powerful voice of dissent arose in the heart of Europe. His name was Jan Hus, a popular preacher and rector of the University of Prague. Living in the early 15th century, Hus was deeply influenced by the writings of the English reformer John Wycliffe. He was not trying to start a new church, but to reform the one he loved. He preached fiery sermons in the Czech language, not Latin, denouncing the moral failings of the clergy. He attacked the practice of selling indulgences, certificates that promised to reduce time in purgatory, as a corrupt and unbiblical fundraising scheme that preyed on the fears of the poor. Hus's message was electrifying. He insisted that the Bible was the ultimate authority for a Christian above any pope or council. He also championed a practice known as utriquism, arguing that all believers, not just the clergy, should receive both the bread and the wine during communion. This was a powerful symbolic challenge to the special status of the priesthood. For Hus, the Church was the entire body of believers, with Christ as its only true head, not the Pope in Rome. His ideas resonated deeply with a growing sense of Czech national identity and resentment against the German-dominated hierarchy. Prague became a center of religious and political ferment. The church authorities could not ignore such a direct challenge. In 1414, Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance in modern-day Germany to defend his views. He was given a promise of safe conduct from the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund. Hus went, believing he could engage in an honest debate and persuade the council fathers of the truth of his reforms. But he had tragically misjudged the situation. Upon his arrival, he was arrested, thrown into a dungeon, and put on trial for heresy. The council demanded that he recant his teachings. Hus refused, stating that he could not renounce what he believed the Bible taught. His conscience, he declared, was bound to the Word of God. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was led out to a field, stripped of his priestly garments and tied to a stake. A paper crown decorated with painted devils was placed on his head, bearing the inscription, "This is a heresiarch," meaning a leader of heretics. As the flames rose around him, it is said that he sang a hymn. His execution was meant to be a warning, a decisive end to a dangerous rebellion. Instead, it lit a fire. News of his martyrdom sparked a full-blown revolution in his homeland of Bohemia. The Hussite wars raged for nearly 2 decades, as Hus's followers fought off multiple crusades sent against them. Though the radical Hussite movement was eventually contained, Hus's ideas and his sacrifice foreshadowed the even greater religious upheaval that would tear Western Christendom apart a century later, the Protestant Reformation. The story of these schisms is the story of how one faith grew into a global family of diverse traditions. The world today is not home to Christianity, but to many Christianities, each with its own unique history, theology, and culture, all stemming from these ancient partings of the way. The Roman Catholic Church, headed by the Pope in Vatican City, remains the largest single Christian body, with over 1 billion members worldwide. Its hierarchical structure, its emphasis on sacraments, and its use of Latin as an official language are all direct descendants of the path taken by the Western Church in the first millennium. Its global reach is a testament to centuries of missionary work that followed the age of exploration. The second largest communion is the Eastern Orthodox Church. It is not a single, centralized body like the Catholic Church, but a fellowship of self-governing churches, such as the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and Serbian Orthodox. The Patriarch of Constantinople is still recognized as the first among equals, a spiritual leader, but without the universal jurisdiction of the Pope. Orthodox worship is renowned for its beauty and mysticism, its ancient liturgies, its rich tradition of chanting, and its deep veneration of icons. For its 250 million followers, Orthodoxy represents an unbroken link to the Church of the Apostles, preserved from what they see as the errors and innovations of the West. Then there are the ancient Oriental Orthodox churches, the spiritual heirs of those who rejected the Council of Chalcedon in 451. These churches, including the Coptic Church of Egypt and the Ethiopian Tewahedo Church, have not only survived but thrived, often in regions where Christians are a minority. They have preserved liturgical languages that date back to the time of Christ, such as Coptic, a form of ancient Egyptian, and Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic. Their theological emphasis on the unified nature of Christ gives their spirituality a distinct flavor, and their ancient traditions stand as a powerful reminder of the very early diversity of Christian thought, long before the more famous East-West Schism. Finally, the landscape was completely redrawn by the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, which itself splintered into thousands of different denominations. From Lutherans and Calvinists to Baptists, Methodists, and Pentecostals, these groups are all heirs of the principle articulated by reformers like Jan Hus and Martin Luther, the primacy of Scripture and the priesthood of all believers. This has led to an incredible diversity of worship styles, from the formal high church services of some Anglicans to the exuberant spirit-filled gatherings of Pentecostal congregations. The painful divisions of the past have, over time, created a vibrant, complex, and sometimes confusing tapestry of global Christianity, with rival claims to authenticity but also an astonishing richness of expression. The Great Schisms were, without a doubt, human tragedies. They were moments of profound failure when pride, politics, and cultural prejudice overwhelmed the Christian call for unity. The excommunications of 1054 were not just theological statements, they were acts of spiritual violence that tore communities apart, severed ancient bonds of fellowship, and led to centuries of suspicion and hostility. The Crusades launched by the West against the Cathars, the Hussites, and even against their fellow Christians in Constantinople in 1204, left deep and painful scars. These divisions were not clean breaks, but messy, agonizing divorces that affected real people, turning neighbors into enemies and fellow believers into heretics. Looking back, we can see the pain and the loss. A unified Christendom, for all its flaws, might have presented a more coherent witness to the world. The energy spent on internal conflicts, theological hair-splitting, and mutual condemnation could have been directed elsewhere. The divisions often provided justification for political conflict and warfare, with princes and emperors using religious differences as a pretext for ambition and conquest. The dream of a single, universal church, a seamless garment of Christ, was torn to shreds. For many, this fracturing of the faith remains a source of deep sorrow and a scandal that undermines the Christian message of reconciliation. Yet, paradoxically, something rich and dynamic also grew from these fractures. In isolation, each tradition was forced to deepen its own unique spiritual insights. The Orthodox world cultivated a profound mystical theology centered on icons and the liturgy. The Catholic Church developed a sophisticated system of philosophy and canon law. The Protestant Reformation unleashed a new emphasis on the individual conscience, biblical literacy, and lay participation. Each schism, while painful, acted as a catalyst for new theological exploration and the development of vibrant, distinct cultures of faith. The world is arguably richer for having the soaring logic of Aquinas, the mystical poetry of Gregory of Nazianzus, and the revolutionary fire of Martin Luther. Today, after centuries of mutual estrangement, there are hopeful signs of dialogue and a greater understanding between these divided traditions. Leaders of the Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant churches meet, pray together, and work on common projects. The excommunications of 1054 were mutually lifted in 1965, a symbolic gesture of healing. While full unity remains a distant dream, the hostility of the past is slowly giving way to a spirit of mutual respect. The story of the Great Schisms is a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and power, but it is also a story of resilience. It shows how a single faith, refracted through different cultures and historical experiences, can produce a dazzling spectrum of belief and practice, a fractured but fascinating testament to the human quest for God.